The year was 1866, and Europe was holding its breath. In the grand capitals of Vienna and Berlin, empires were sharpening their swords, while diplomats shuffled papers that would soon be worthless. But this story doesn't begin in those marble halls of power. No, this story begins in a place so small, so seemingly insignificant, that most maps of the era struggled to find room to print its name: Liechtenstein. Picture, if you will, a sliver of land nestled between the towering peaks of the Alps, a principality so modest that you could walk across it in a day if you were determined. A place where everyone knew everyone, where the prince could greet his subjects by name, where the most exciting event of the year was usually the harvest festival. This was Liechtenstein in the spring of 1866, a realm of farmers and vintners, of quiet valleys and church bells that marked time in a rhythm unchanged for centuries. But the world beyond those mountain passes was changing rapidly, violently even, and Liechtenstein was about to be pulled into a conflict that would reshape the very fabric of Central Europe. The tension had been building for years, like pressure in a sealed kettle. On one side stood the Austrian Empire, that aging colossus that had dominated German-speaking lands for centuries, its legitimacy flowing from ancient tradition and the weight of history. On the other stood Prussia, young, ambitious, industrial, modern, led by Otto von Bismarck, a man who famously declared that great questions would be settled not by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. Between these two giants stood dozens of smaller states, members of what was called the German Confederation, an organization so loose and ineffective that it made herding cats seem like a precisely executed military operation. Liechtenstein, despite its size, was one of these confederation members, and when Austria called for support against Prussian aggression, Prince Johann II faced an impossible decision. He commanded a nation of barely 3,000 souls, a country whose entire military tradition could be written on a single page with room to spare for a shopping list. What could Liechtenstein possibly contribute to a war between empires? Yet honor demanded a response. Treaties required it. And so, in what must have been one of the most peculiar mobilizations in military history, Liechtenstein prepared for war. They called it the Federal Army Contingent of Liechtenstein, which sounds far more impressive than it actually was. 80 men. That's all they could muster without completely depleting their farms and workshops. 80 souls, mostly farmers and craftsmen who'd been drilling occasionally on Sunday afternoons, now expected to stand beside professional Austrian soldiers against the Prussian war machine that had been perfected through decades of militaristic education and iron discipline. The commander of this miniature force was a man named Captain Ludwig von Hinterstoisser, an Austrian officer who must have wondered what cosmic joke had assigned him to lead what amounted to a heavily armed neighborhood watch. But if he harbored doubts, he kept them to himself. These were his men now, and he would lead them with whatever dignity the situation allowed. The preparation in Vaduz, Liechtenstein's capital, must have been something to behold. Imagine mothers weeping as they packed food for sons who'd never traveled more than 20 miles from home. Picture fathers pressing ancient hunting rifles into young hands, offering advice about keeping powder dry and heads down. The entire population turned out to watch as the contingent assembled in the main square, looking less like an army and more like a particularly well-armed hiking club. They marched out on a June morning, these 80 souls of Liechtenstein, heading toward the Austrian border to link up with Habsburg forces defending the Confederation against Prussian ambitions. The war they were marching toward had already earned several names: the German War, the 7 Weeks' War, the Fraternal War. History would eventually settle on the Austro-Prussian War, but for these men of Liechtenstein, it was simply the great unknown that awaited them beyond their peaceful valleys. What they didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that this war would be over almost before it began. Bismarck had planned everything with characteristic precision. The Prussian needle gun, a breech-loading rifle that could be fired from a prone position at a rate several times faster than the muzzleloaders used by Austrian forces, was about to revolutionize warfare. The Prussian army moved with railroad efficiency, literally, using the new railway networks to mobilize and concentrate forces with a speed that left traditional military thinkers baffled. The Liechtenstein contingent was assigned to guard the Tyrolean border, specifically the area around the town of Feldkirch, just across their own frontier in Austrian territory. This was, by the standards of the wider war, a strategic backwater. The real fighting was happening far to the north, where massive armies clashed in battles that would be studied by military academies for generations. Names like Königsgrätz, where over 500,000 men fought the largest battles since Leipzig in 1813, would echo through history books. But in the quiet valleys near Feldkirch, the men of Liechtenstein stood their watch. They patrolled mountain passes where the only enemy they encountered was boredom and the occasional smuggler who looked more surprised than threatening. They drilled, they waited, they wrote letters home describing their great military adventure, which consisted mainly of card games and complaints about the food. Captain von Hinterstoisser kept his men disciplined and alert, even though it became increasingly clear that no Prussian force was going to come anywhere near their position. The Prussians were too busy winning the war in spectacular fashion hundreds of miles away. In 7 weeks, exactly as the war's eventual name would suggest, the Prussian military machine systematically dismantled Austrian resistance. The Battle of Königsgrätz on July 3rd was decisive. In a single day of fighting, the Austrian army suffered nearly 50,000 casualties. The empire that had dominated Central Europe for centuries was brought to its knees by modern weaponry and superior tactics. When news of the defeat reached the Tyrolean border posts, there was disbelief. How could such a large army collapse so quickly? For the men of Liechtenstein, this news brought a mixture of relief and something like disappointment. They'd marched to war and found nothing to fight. Some of the younger soldiers, fed on romantic notions of military glory, felt cheated. They'd wanted to prove themselves, to return home with stories of heroism. Instead, they had stories of standing in beautiful Alpine meadows, watching clouds drift over mountain peaks. But there was one man among them who would provide a story, though not in any way anyone expected. His name was Andreas Hofer, though not the famous Tyrolean rebel by that name, just a common soldier, an Austrian liaison officer who'd been attached to the Liechtenstein contingent to help with communications and coordination. Some accounts call him an Italian friend, others describe him differently, but what matters is this: he wasn't originally part of the 80 men who marched out from Vaduz. Andreas had befriended the Liechtenstein soldiers during their weeks of service. He'd shared meals with them, laughed at their jokes, helped them navigate the confusing world of military bureaucracy. And when the word came down that the war was over, that Austria had sued for peace, that all federal forces were to return home, Andreas made a decision. He had no home to return to in the traditional sense. The Austria he'd served was being dismantled. The Confederation was dissolving. Prussia was reshaping the German world into something new. And men like Andreas, soldiers of the old order, weren't sure where they fit in anymore. So when the Liechtenstein contingent prepared to march home, Andreas asked if he might join them. Captain von Hinterstoisser agreed without hesitation. What was one more man on the road? The soldiers welcomed him. And so, on a bright morning in August 1866, the Federal Army contingent of Liechtenstein began their march home. The journey back took several days. They walked the same roads they'd traveled weeks before, but everything seemed different now. The world had changed while they'd been away. The old German Confederation was dead. Prussia was ascendant, Austria was diminished. The delicate balance of power that had kept Central Europe relatively peaceful for decades had been shattered. But for the men of Liechtenstein, marching home through Alpine valleys with the sun on their faces and the knowledge that they were going back to their farms and families unharmed, the geopolitical implications seemed distant. They sang as they marched, old songs from their valleys, drinking songs, hymns they'd learned as children. Andreas, walking among them, learned the words and sang along. When they crested the final ridge and saw Vaduz spread below them, someone started counting. It's something soldiers do when returning from campaign, an old tradition to account for everyone. 1, 2, 3, the count went up the line. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 75, 80. Someone counted again because the first number seemed wrong. 81. There were 81 men preparing to march into Vaduz. The realization spread through the ranks like ripples in a pond. Captain von Hinterstoisser confirmed it himself. They'd left with 80 men. They were returning with 81. Not a single casualty, not even a deserter to balance the ledger. They'd gone to war and come back with more than they started with. The people of Vaduz poured out to meet them, expecting to count their losses, to begin the grieving that war always brings. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of what might be history's most peculiar military homecoming. Every mother found her son. Every wife found her husband. Every father counted his boys. And there was one extra, this Andreas, who'd adopted Liechtenstein as his new home and whom Liechtenstein seemed happy to adopt in return. The story spread quickly, as good stories do, the tiny country that went to war with 80 men and returned with 81. It became a joke, then an anecdote, then a legend. Other nations counted their dead in thousands, tens of thousands. Liechtenstein counted gains. In Vienna, in the aftermath of a catastrophic defeat, when accountants tallied losses that would take generations to recover from, someone noted the report from the Liechtenstein contingent with dark humor. At least someone profited from this disaster, they might have said. In Berlin, where Bismarck was busy creating a new North German Confederation that excluded Austria entirely, reshaping the map of Central Europe to Prussia's advantage, perhaps someone read the report and smiled. War had always been about mathematics, about calculating gains and losses. Liechtenstein had found a way to make the math work in their favor, even if by accident. But the real significance of this story runs deeper than its surface charm. Consider what happened in the broader context of that summer of 1866. The Austro-Prussian War killed thousands of soldiers and changed the political landscape of Europe forever. It was a step toward German unification under Prussia, which would lead to the Franco-Prussian War 4 years later, which would lead to the tensions that eventually erupted in World War I. The path from Königsgrätz to the Somme is indirect but traceable. Liechtenstein's experience in this war represented something different, an alternative narrative to the grand sweep of power politics. Here was a tiny nation that had maintained its independence not through military might or strategic genius, but something harder to quantify. Prudence, perhaps, or luck, or a combination of both. They'd fulfilled their treaty obligations without sacrificing their people. They'd participated in history without being crushed by it. After 1866, Liechtenstein made a decision that would define its future. They disbanded their army entirely. This wasn't a gradual downsizing or a temporary measure. They simply decided that a nation of their size had no business maintaining military forces. It was an acknowledgement of reality, but also an act of remarkable courage. In a world where power flowed from the barrel of a gun, Liechtenstein chose to be unarmed. This decision could have been disastrous. History is littered with small nations that were absorbed by larger neighbors, that disappeared from the map because they couldn't defend themselves. But Liechtenstein survived. More than survived. They thrived. They maintained their independence through diplomacy, through careful neutrality. They're making themselves useful to their neighbors without threatening anyone. Today, Liechtenstein remains one of the world's smallest and wealthiest nations. They're known for banking, for low taxes, for being a place where successful people park their money. It's not romantic, perhaps, but it works. The last soldier of Liechtenstein marched home in August 1866 with 80 of his companions and one unexpected friend, and the country has been at peace ever since. Think about what that means. 160 years without fielding an army, without fighting a war, without losing sons to violence. How many nations can make that claim? How many peoples have known that kind of sustained peace? The story of the 81 soldiers has become part of Liechtenstein's national identity, but it's often told as a joke, a funny anecdote about a war where nothing happened. But perhaps we should see it differently. Perhaps it's a story about wisdom, about knowing your limitations and acting accordingly. Perhaps it's about the courage to choose peace when everyone around you is choosing war. Captain von Hinterstoisser returned to Austrian service and eventually retired with honors, though his most famous command remained those 80 farmers from Liechtenstein who never fired a shot in anger. Andreas Hofer, the 81st man, settled in Liechtenstein and lived out his days there, becoming a minor footnote and a footnote of history, the man who made the math strange.
The men themselves returned to their farms and workshops. They told their stories at taverns, probably embellishing them over the years as soldiers do. They grew old, these veterans of a war where they saw no combat, guardians of a border that was never crossed. One by one they passed away, taking with them memories of that strange summer when they marched to war and found only waiting. The last veteran of Liechtenstein's military adventure of 1866 died sometime in the early 20th century, probably watching in horror as Europe tore itself apart in the First World War, grateful perhaps that his little country had learned its lesson decades earlier. Liechtenstein remained neutral in that war and in the Second World War that followed, maintaining its independence through the worst violence humanity has ever inflicted on itself. There's a lesson here, not the one usually drawn from military history. We're taught to celebrate great victories, to study brilliant campaigns, to admire successful generals. We build monuments to warriors and name streets after battles. The story of warfare is usually told through the lens of conquest and glory. But what about the story of the 81? What about the army that went nowhere and did nothing and came home whole? What about the nation that learned that survival doesn't require violence, that independence doesn't demand an army, that there are other ways to navigate a dangerous world? In the grand narrative of the Austro-Prussian War, Liechtenstein barely merits a footnote. Historians focus on Bismarck's diplomacy, on Prussian military reforms, on the battles that killed thousands and reshaped nations. The story of 80 men standing guard in peaceful valleys while empires collapsed around them seems trivial by comparison. But trivial for whom? Not for the mothers who got their sons back, not for the wives who weren't widowed, not for the children who grew up with fathers instead of just stories and gravestones. For them, Liechtenstein's bloodless campaign was the most important event of 1866. The mathematical absurdity of returning from war with more men than you started with has made this story memorable, turned it into a curiosity that appears in lists of strange historical facts. But strip away the numbers, and what you have is simpler and more profound. A small group of people went into a dangerous situation, and all came home safely. Isn't that ultimately what we should want from our military adventures? Not glory, not conquest, not the satisfaction of vanquished enemies, but simply the safe return of those we sent away. Liechtenstein today is a constitutional monarchy, prosperous and peaceful, a member of the United Nations but not the European Union, maintaining that careful balance of engagement and independence that has served them for over a century and a half. They have a police force but no army. They rely on Switzerland for defense should it ever be needed, but it never has been. Walk through Builds today and you'll find a modern European town, small by any standard, with a castle overlooking the valley where the prince still resides. There are museums and galleries, banks and boutiques, restaurants serving food from around the world. Tourists come to take photographs and buy stamps because Liechtenstein's stamps are famously beautiful and valuable to collectors. You won't find many monuments to military glory because there isn't any military glory to memorialize. But there is a monument to peace, to the decision made after 1866 to pursue a different path. It's not grandiose, not the kind of thing that draws crowds, but it's there, a quiet acknowledgement of the road not taken. The 81 soldiers, that mathematical anomaly, that impossible accounting, represents something important about how we remember history and what we choose to celebrate. Their story has endured not because they fought bravely, not because they achieved victory over overwhelming odds, but because they came home, all of them, and then some. In a century that would go on to see the worst violence in human history, where entire generations were fed into the meat grinder of industrial warfare, where nations measured their sacrifices in millions of dead, the story of a country that went to war and lost nothing feels almost miraculous. It's a reminder that the greatest military achievement isn't conquering territory or defeating enemies, but preserving life. The world that the 81 men marched home to in August 1866 was changing rapidly, becoming the modern world we recognize today. Railways and telegraphs were shrinking distances, industry was transforming economies, nationalism was redrawing maps, and military technology was making war ever more devastating. In this world of iron and blood, as Bismarck called it, Liechtenstein chose a different path. That choice, made possible by geography and luck and prudent leadership, has allowed this tiny nation to survive into an era when most
small states have been absorbed into larger entities. Liechtenstein remains defiantly itself, a reminder that there are alternatives to the logic of power politics that dominates international relations. So when we tell the story of the 81 soldiers, let's tell it not just as a curiosity or a joke, but as a parable, a story about wisdom and restraint, about knowing when to fight and when to stand aside, about the courage it takes to choose peace when everyone around you is choosing war. Let's tell it as a story about 80 men who went to war and 81 who came home, and about the nation that learned from that experience to pursue a different kind of greatness. In the end, Liechtenstein's greatest victory wasn't on any battlefield. It was the decision, made in the aftermath of 1866, that they didn't need to fight anymore, that they could be small and peaceful and prosperous, that they could maintain their independence without maintaining an army, that they could write their own story without writing it in blood. The 81 soldiers marched home that August day to a country that would never send soldiers to war again. They returned to families and farms, to ordinary lives in an extraordinary little country. And in their safe return, in the mathematical impossibility of gaining rather than losing men in wartime, they gave Liechtenstein a story worth telling. A reminder that sometimes the best military strategy is simply to bring everyone home alive.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.